All right, I think we're ready to go. Welcome, everyone. Thanks. I hope you're having a great day. It's a beautiful day. And I think we're going to have a fascinating evening tonight. This is our annual Lev Dobriansky Lecture in Political Economy. We had his bio up there earlier. We established this lecture in 1996 to honor a distinguished American who was also a dear friend of the Fund for American Studies. Ambassador Lev Dobriansky passed away in 2008, but we keep his spirit alive through this annual lecture. He played a key role in establishing TFAS's academic programs in 1970 when we initially partnered with Georgetown University, where he was a longtime professor. He served as our academic director from 1970 to 1982, to be succeeded by Professor George Vixtens and now Professor Ann Bradley. He left us and Georgetown in 1982 when President Ronald Reagan appointed him the U.S. ambassador to the Bahamas. That would be a great posting to get, wouldn't it? I'd take it. We've had a number of very distinguished speakers in this series. We've had Nobel laureates, Federal Reserve Bank presidents, past members of the president's cabinet, renowned economists and political scientists. And I think tonight we have a fascinating presentation for you. Ambassador Dobriansky wrote the first Captive Nations Proclamation, where the president, at that time Eisenhower, proclaimed Captive Nations Week. And it's a proclamation that's been issued by every American president every year up through last summer when President Joe Biden issued the proclamation. It urges Americans to reaffirm their commitment to seeking liberty, justice, and self-determination for all peoples in the world. In 2005, Lev Dobriansky was honored with a Lifetime Achievement Award from the National Captive Nations Committee and the Ukraine Congress leadership. He was a Ukrainian-American. He was a regular speaker each summer in our programs. He was very prescient in his analysis of the then Soviet Union. He predicted its collapse as early as 1967 in a work called The Vulnerable Russians. And he emphasized that the Soviet Union, or Russia rather, without Ukraine is a weak, weak country, and that it needs Ukraine, in a sense predicting that Russia would attempt to take over Ukraine again. Very interesting is that he was a force behind the Victims of Communism Memorial that's up on 4th in New Jersey. I hope you see it when you pass up toward Union Station, dedicated in 2007 by President George W. Bush. And he was the inspiration for the Victims of Communism Museum in downtown DC, which I think many of you are going to this week. And our chairman, Randy Teague, who serves on their board of directors. The last thing I want to mention about him, that although he died in 2008, he left behind a manuscript, handwritten manuscript that his daughter got a hold of, and with the help of another individual and under the auspices of the Fund for American Studies, she edited this manuscript and was published this past February by the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. And it's called Unyielding Resolve, Captive Nations and the Path to Freedom. So even though he died 17 years ago, his analysis of the Soviet Union in particular is as valid today as it was when he lived and predicted events. Now tonight we're going to be hearing from Marian Tupy, the founder and editor of humanprogress.org and a senior fellow at the Cato Institutes Center for Global Liberty and Prosperity. Marian is the co-author of the Simon Abundance Index, the book Superabundance, the story of population growth, innovation, and human flourishing in an infinitely bountiful planet. You'll see it up there. He also wrote 10 global trends that every smart person should know, and many others you will find interesting. His articles have been published in the Washington Post, the Financial Times, the LA Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Atlantic, Newsweek, the UK Spectator, Foreign Policy Magazine, and many other outlets. He's appeared on BBC, CNN, CNBC, MSNBC, Fox News, and my podcast, the Liberty and Leadership Podcast, which was recorded last week and will be released in a couple of weeks. So if you don't get enough tonight, you can listen to the podcast. Marian Tupy received his BA in International Relations and Classics from the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa, Johannesburg, South Africa, and he got his PhD in International Relations at the University of St. Andrews in the United Kingdom. His family's originally from Czechoslovakia, but he lives now in the United States. Marian's book, Superabundance, offers a somewhat counterintuitive idea of why population growth and freedom to innovate make the Earth's resources more, not less abundant. He's way out ahead of the current discussion on abundance by several years and has a different take on the subject that I think is very important. As Dr. Tupy puts it, too many people follow the headlines rather than the trend lines when reaching conclusions about the human condition. Covering topics of poverty and health, literacy and the environmental quality, gender equality, economic freedom, Dr. Tupy and his colleagues at humanprogress.org have analyzed trend lines and provide information of tremendous importance to policymakers and to all Americans. I think you'll enjoy his remarks. I think they'll challenge us all, and we'll leave plenty of time for questions and discussion afterwards. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Marian Tupy.
Thanks, Roger. Thanks. It works. Hi, can you hear me? Well, wonderful. Thank you so much, Roger, for that wonderful introduction, and thanks to all of you for coming. I mean, what an extraordinary turnout. I appreciate it. So my talk today is going to be about resources, and especially about the human ability to expand our resource base into infinity. Infinity is a defining word here, and I'm sure that at least in the Q&A there will be some questions about how we can maintain and expand our resource base really ad infinitum. The basic premise of my talk is that the more people we have, the more ideas we have. The more ideas we have, the more innovations and inventions we have. The more inventions and innovations we have, the more productivity gains we can get, and consequently our standards of living increase. And my argument is going to be that not in spite of, but because of population growth, lives of today's ordinary people are better than those of the kings and queens of yesteryear. Now, the connection between population growth and new ideas, new inventions and innovations, and prosperity is a well-trodden territory. I'm not presenting to you something completely new. This notion that people create ideas which lead to innovations and then to greater prosperity has been endorsed by Nobel Prize-winning economists such as Paul Romer, Robert Lucas, and Michael Kramer. Unfortunately, the beneficial relationship between the number of people and human well-being is not universally accepted.
A great under-discussed factor in the climate crisis is there are just too many of us, and we use too much shit. Climate deniers like to say, there's no population problem, just look out the window of an airplane, something but empty space down there. But it's not about space, it's about resources. Humans are already using 1.7 times the resources the planet can support. In 1900, there were less than 2 billion people on Earth. Now it's approaching 8. We can't just keep going on like this. The world is just too crowded.
There are not enough people. I can't emphasize this enough. There are not enough people. And I think one of the biggest risks to civilization is the low birth rate and the rapidly declining birth rate. It is, and yet so many people, including smart people, think that there are too many people in the world and think that the population is growing out of control. it's completely the opposite.
There's scientific consensus that the lives of children are going to be very difficult, and it does lead, I think, young people to have a legitimate question. You know, is it okay to still have children?
Is it a legitimate question? Is there a scientific consensus? Let's dig in. People have been wondering about the relationship between population growth and resource abundance for a very long time. In 1798, an English scholar and preacher called Thomas Malthus claimed to have shown mathematically that population increases at an exponential rate, which is to say 1, 2, 4, 16, that's the red line, whereas resources only grow at an arithmetic or linear rate, 1, 2, 3, 4, and that's the green line. And the gap between the two rates, Malthus maintained, must lead to starvation, right? Population is growing at an exponential rate. Resources are growing at an arithmetical rate. Consequently, you have to have, the gap will be starvation. Now, the debate over the relationship between population growth and resources reached a fever pitch in the second half of the 20th century, after the Second World War, when populations of what was back then called the Third World, but especially Asia, boomed, later also in Africa, primarily as a result of the spread of new scientific knowledge and better technologies and better medicines to those countries. In 1968, the Stanford University biologist Paul Ehrlich, he's still alive, he's about 94 now, picked up the baton of overpopulation from Malthus in his best-selling book, The Population Bomb. And in the book, he wrote, "The battle to feed all of humanity is over. In the 1970s, hundreds of millions of people will starve to death in spite of any crash programs embarked upon now." Ehrlich scared and scarred generations of Americans, with his ideas being turned into movies, such as the 1973 offering Soylent Green. Now, in the movie, some of us, I don't know if anybody here remembers when it came out, but in the movie, the world is so overpopulated that every time a person dies, he or she is turned into a biscuit called the Soylent Green, which is then fed to the people who are still alive. Note the date in the top left-hand corner of this original poster. This is what Hollywood thought America was going to look like in 2022, which is, incidentally, when the book came out. Here is a clip from the movie.
What is the secret of Soylent Green?
They're making our food out of people. Next thing, they'll be breeding us like cattle for food. You gotta tell them. You gotta tell them.
Promise, Tiger, I promise. I'll tell the exchange.
You tell everybody. Listen to me, Hatcher. You gotta tell them Soylent Green is people! We gotta stop them somehow!
Anybody recognizes the actor? Yes, sir. Very good. Excellent actor. Sometimes overacting, maybe, but there it is. Well, it's 2025, and we are still not eating one another. Instead of starvation, we have an abundance of choices. I chose this particular picture because it reminds me when I go to Whole Foods and I have to choose olive oil from California, Greece, Portugal, Spain. Sometimes it's light, sometimes it's virgin, sometimes it's extra virgin, sometimes it's robust, sometimes it's even cold-pressed, even though I don't know what cold-pressed is. But in fact, the food supply has improved throughout the world to a point where the world no longer faces famines as it used to outside of war zones. So all those issues that people have been wondering over in the 1970s and 1980s about running out of food, our problem today is the opposite one, which is obesity. Now, in Superabundance, we attempt to quantify the growing abundance of commodities by looking at their prices. Rising price of a commodity means greater scarcity. A falling price of a commodity means greater abundance. And prices reflect the behavior and expectations of over 8 billion people. In a sense, you can think about the free market as a giant calculator, providing just-in-time, best possible estimate regarding what is scarce and what is abundant. But which prices are we going to use? There are a lot of prices. One is the nominal price. Nominal price is the price that you see in the shop. When you go and buy a loaf of bread, there is a little sticker next to it showing that the bread costs, whatever it is, $2. But this is a sophisticated audience, so you know that if you are looking at prices or affordability of goods over a long period of time, you have to do what? You have to adjust for inflation. And when you adjust for inflation, that gives you real price. This is a picture of a loaf of bread being sold in Germany during hyperinflation in 1922 for 1,000 billion Deutschmarks or Reichsmarks back then. So accounting for inflation is very important. Now, unfortunately, both real price and nominal price have one big shortcoming, which is they do not account for what is happening in your wallet. This is where time prices come into it. You often hear your grandparents say things like, oh, when I was a young man, a gallon of gas cost, I don't know, 15 cents. That may be true, but he or she was also only making $5 an hour. So to get a proper sense of what is happening in terms of affordability, we cannot just look at prices, we also have to look at how much money we are making. Time price is calculated by dividing the nominal price of a good, that's the one that you see in a shop, by the nominal hourly wage that you are making at the time of the purchase. Whereas nominal and real prices are measured in dollars and cents, time prices are measured in hours and minutes. Simply put, time price tells you how long you have to work in order to be able to afford to buy something. If today you are making $25 an hour and a pound of beef costs $25, then a pound of beef costs 1 hour of labor. If in 20 years' time you are making $50 an hour and a pound of beef costs $25 an hour, then you are twice as well off. You are now able to purchase 2 pounds of beef for an hour of labor, right? Now, why would we want to estimate affordability or abundance with time prices? Well, the first reason is that time prices capture both the changes in prices and wages. Productivity gains can come from two different ways, or in two different ways. If, for example, you improve your agricultural production methods and the price of and the amount of wheat that you produce increases, then the price of wheat is going to come down. But at the same time, maybe you are replacing a farmer armed with just a sickle or a scythe with a modern tractor with a GPS and whatever else. So instead of having a peasant with a sickle, you now have a blue-collar worker who is much more productive and who is much better rewarded, who is earning much more money. So a worker is earning more money, and the price of a commodity is falling because of productivity gains. And time price allows you to combine these two productivity gains into one price. Also, time prices don't rely on official estimation of inflation. It doesn't matter whether over the next 10 years the inflation is 1% or 1 million%. You are always comparing nominal prices and nominal wages at the beginning of your assessment as well as the end. So what happens in between doesn't really matter. Third reason why we use time prices is because they allow us to make comparisons across countries and across different periods of time. In our book, we look at time prices of commodities going back 200 years. Sometimes the currencies in which they were originally measured no longer exist. But when you look at time prices, they are the same globally. An hour of work is the same in China as this in the United States. It is the same in the United States in 1925 as it is in 2025. So it's a much better, much more credible way of measuring stuff. And time prices are measured in time. And that's important because time is an independent variable. It's independent of human perception. It is constant for general purposes, unless you are thinking about Einstein's theory of relativity. For most of us, time is constant. And time is also equal, meaning everybody has only 24 hours in a day. So it really matters what you do with those 24 hours. If you live in India today, you're probably spending 8 hours a day to earn enough food to feed your family. If you live in the United States, you're probably spending 30 minutes a day to earn enough food to feed your family, and the 7.5 hours you are spending, or rather you are earning money to buy something else in addition to the food. Maybe a refrigerator, maybe a bicycle, maybe a car, or maybe a trip to the Caribbean. So let's look at a specific example through which I will demonstrate how time prices are calculated. So a nominal price of a loaf of bread, once again, the loaf of bread that you see in a shop in 1980 was 50 cents. By 2025, this rose to $1.93. So in nominal terms, a loaf of bread increased by 286%. Very often, when you open a newspaper, somebody will write that prices have never been this high. Well, of course not, if you're looking at nominal prices. So what we have to do, and what our journalists very often don't do, is to convert nominal prices into real prices. So 50 cents in 1980 is equivalent to $2.04 in 2025. But we know that a loaf of bread in 2025 cost $1.93, and consequently we can say that bread got 5% cheaper. Okay? It's a huge difference where the bread has become 300% more expensive or 5% cheaper. Now we convert it into a time price. Once again, bread cost 50 cents back in 1980. But hourly wage of a typical American blue-collar worker was $6.57, which means that our typical blue-collar worker had to work 4 minutes and 57 seconds in order to buy a loaf of bread. By 2025, the price of bread increased to $1.93, but hourly wage of a blue-collar worker rose to $30.84, which means that our worker now only has to work 3 minutes and 76. Well, hold on, there's 60 seconds. What I mean is 3.76 minutes, that's what I meant. And consequently, bread got actually 18% cheaper. Okay? So by looking at nominal prices, we are looking at 300% increase. By looking at time prices, we are looking at 18% cheaper. Okay. So last year, I looked at a very long time perspective. Don't panic over all of these numbers. I looked at the prices of food in the United States between 1919 and 2024. Why 1919? Not because I'm trying to cherry pick. It's basically what I found. There were government records from 1919 for a bunch of food commodities. There are actually 42. I'm not showing you all of them because you wouldn't be able to read it. I'm just showing you some of them. And actually, I'm not going to go through obviously all of them. I'm just going to look at one of them, which is eggs. Eggs became something of an electoral hot potato, or maybe a hot egg, during the last election because eggs went up in price quite dramatically because of the inflation during the last administration. So you have to keep in mind that two things are possible. One is that eggs can become more expensive due to inflation in the last 3 or 4 years, but that also they are extraordinarily cheap by historical standards, and that's what I'm trying to demonstrate to you now. So a dozen eggs in 1919 cost 61 cents in 1919 dollars. In 2024, a dozen eggs cost $1.96. So in nominal price, in nominal terms, eggs rose in price by 219%. But once you look at time prices, what you see that in 1919, a typical blue-collar worker had to work 1.4 hours in order to buy a dozen eggs, whereas by 2024, that fell to 0.05 hours. Okay? That means that the time price of eggs over that 125-year period decreased by 96%. Now let me stop here and make sure you understand what I'm saying. Prices can increase ad infinitum. They can increase by 10%, 100%, 1,000%, million%, trillion%. But they can only decrease by how much? By 100%. Once something falls in price by 100%, it becomes free. Prices of eggs in America fell by 96%, which means that the same amount of labor which got you 1 dozen eggs in 1919 now got you 26.5 dozen eggs in 2024, which means that abundance of eggs increased by 2,500%, which means that egg abundance increases every 21 years. So if the current trend continues, in 21 years, you will be able to afford 53 dozen eggs for the same amount of labor that would have bought 1 dozen eggs in 1919. Are you with me? More or less. Now, a similar pattern emerges when you look at global abundance from the perspective of an average inhabitant of the world. Let's say somebody living in Mexico. In our book, we looked at prices, time prices of 50 commodities between the years of 1980 and 2018. That's the much maligned period of globalization. And what we found is that on average, time prices of these 50 commodities, only some of which you see here because otherwise you wouldn't be able to read it, fell by 72%, which means that abundance of these commodities from the perspective of a Mexican worker, somebody right in the middle of the workers in the world, has increased by 252%, or to put it differently, instead of 1 unit in this basket of commodities, he or she can now buy 3.5 units in that basket of commodities. Okay? Now, in our book, we looked at 18 different data sets going back to 1850. We measured hundreds of commodities. We measured metals, minerals, fuels, foods, even some services. And these were 18 different data sets. So I'm going to show you 18 different points, but they don't mean, every point that I'm going to show you doesn't mean individual commodity. It is a data set filled with commodities. Some of them have hundreds of commodities in them. Now, this particular chart has growth in population on the x-axis from 0 to 6,000. And it has the increase in abundance of commodities on the y-axis, also from 0 to 6,000. Note that there is nothing down here, meaning we have not found a single data set which was becoming less abundant. Okay, so this is 0. If we had data here, it would mean that stuff is becoming less abundant. Obviously, we don't have that line here or axis here because everything is becoming more abundant. But abundance can increase at 2 different rates. If abundance of commodities increases at the same rate as population, you would expect to find all of our data points along the 45-degree line. So let's say, for example, that population increases by 2%, and abundance of commodities increases by 2%, then you would see all of these points aligned on this line. If population was increasing at 2%, but abundance only at 1%, we would just call it increasing abundance. Superabundance denotes a territory where abundance increases at a higher rate than population. So if population increases at 2%, but abundance increases of 3 or more percent, then we would expect to find them here. So where did our 18 data sets fall? All of them were in the superabundant territory. So remember this chart, which so obsessed Malthus: population increase at an exponential rate, resources at an arithmetical rate. The reality looks something like this. It is resources which are increasing at a faster pace than population. And the difference, the gap between the two rates, that's the new knowledge created in the human mind. On average, every one of us creates more than we consume. That is why our resources can increase at a higher rate than population. In our model, the process of knowledge creation starts with the overall population. Data suggests that only a small fraction of humanity invents or innovates something. So the more people you have, the greater the absolute number of people who are going to actually invent or innovate something. Like this guy, Patrick Bell, who in 1828 invented one of the first machines to bring in the harvest. And over the next 100 years, during the process of market invention and innovation, we end up with something like this: a sophisticated machine run by computers and GPS machines, which enable us to increase our productivity until we are left with shelves in our shops groaning with affordable and abundant bread. But of course, population size is not all that matters. If population was all that mattered, China would have been the world's most abundant or richest countries for the last 2,500 years. China got united 200 years BC, so for the last 2,200 years, it would have been the richest country. It's always been the most populous place in the world. But it's only after China liberalized, after it opened up, after it allowed its people to have a go, to invent, to innovate, to invest, to profit, that the Chinese government unleashed the creative abilities of the Chinese people and turned a poor country into a rich one. Now the question is, can superabundance continue? Our book talks about an infinitely bountiful planet, which may seem counterintuitive because the world really has only a finite number of atoms. And in fact, most Americans would probably agree with Kenneth Boulding, the American environmentalist, who says anyone who believes in indefinite growth on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist. But from a wealth-creating perspective, the number of atoms matters relatively little. This is Lamborghini Huracan worth $250,000, and this is Lamborghini Huracan worth $5,000. The number of atoms is exactly the same, but they've been arranged differently. The first one intelligently, and the second chaotically. So human intelligence is vital, for it allows to grow our resource pie. How does it happen? Let's go through some of the ways in which human beings can increase the resources available for our use. One is increased supply. Every time a price of a commodity increases in price, you have much more of an incentive to look for new deposits of resources, such as oil, lithium, or gas. Or we can increase supply through technological breakthroughs. Many of the wells out of which we are now getting gas and oil have been uneconomical when drilled with traditional methods. But because of fracking, we can now get to oil and gas that was previously uneconomical. It was too hard or too expensive to get. Now we can get it. It's much easier to recycle metals due to electric arc furnaces. And of course, technological breakthroughs such as Haber-Bosch process of creating synthetic fertilizer allows us to feed twice as many people as we would be able to if we relied on natural fertilizer only. We can also increase efficiency. A can of Coke used to weigh 3 ounces of aluminum. Today, it's half an ounce. Plastic bottles are contain 50% less plastic than they did previously. Even glass bottles are now 25% more efficient than they used to be. But it's not just relative efficiency, it's also absolute efficiency. For the longest time, our economic growth and resource use were going in parallel. About 20 years ago, we started seeing a great decoupling. Our economic growth continues, but the total, not the relative, the absolute amount of resources that we use in the American economy has actually started to decrease. Ido Wernick from Rockefeller University found that out of 100 economic resources mostly used or most used in the American economy, 41 of them are beyond peak, meaning we are still deriving economic benefit from them, we are still growing our economy, but we are using less and less of those resources. And that includes cropland, meaning we can grow more food on ever-shrinking number of acres. Okay? We are also using less copper, less water per dollar of output, less iron, and so forth. Another way in which you can increase your resources by deriving ever greater value from a resource. For example, take sand. When humans 3,500 years ago first figured out that by heating sand to 3,090 degrees Fahrenheit, you could turn it into glass, we started using glass for human beautification, beads. Much later, we realized that we could use glass for cups and then for windows, and now we use sand in fiberglass and in microchips. So with every step of the way, the value added from melting sand has increased dramatically. Lithium is used to be used only in ceramics, but now, of course, we are using it in lithium-ion batteries, which power our electric vehicles. Graphite used to be used in pencils only. Now we are building aircraft out of it. So you can see how you can increase value from something that previously was only used for primitive uses. We can also turn something that was useless into something that was useful. When we first started drilling for oil, we would come across natural gas. And that was incredibly dangerous. One, we didn't know what to do with it. Secondly, it was highly flammable, so every time a worker on a rig lit a cigarette, the whole thing blew up, right? Today, in poor countries, they still do what we used to do, which is we flare, we burn off the gas as it comes out of the ground, which is not just wasteful economically, but it is also incredibly environmentally damaging. In the United States, instead, we capture that natural gas and then we pipe it into homes where they can warm us in winter. In fact, you could argue that everything is useless without the necessary technological development. Oil was useless before we had cars, to give just one example. Substitution is a much underappreciated yet incredibly important aspect in economics. Substitution, we don't, as human beings, we don't care how we get from point A to B. What we care about is that we do have that light in the evening to read our books and whatever. How we do it, how we get that light is not terribly relevant to us. Yet through substitution, we were able to save our whales because we no longer kill them for spermaceti in their brain out of which we fashioned candles, or for their oil. Now we use petroleum. Instead of cutting down forests in order to power our industry, we used coal. And now we are moving to other sources, hydrogen and nuclear energy and so forth. Instead of guano, which is basically bird poop off the coast of Chile, which we used to mine and then spread on our crops in order to grow bigger, we now use synthetic fertilizer, which comes from natural gas. Instead of animal fur, we have synthetics. And in the future, we'll be using, instead of lithium, we'll be using something like sodium-ion batteries. So all those people who are worrying, what is going to happen in the future? Are we going to have enough lithium in order to run all those electric vehicles? Well, who says that we are going to be needing lithium in 20 years' time? Maybe it will be sodium-ion batteries. And sodium is one of the most abundant sources on Earth. Another way in which humans can extend their resource base is through dematerialization. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, when you walked into an American hotel room, it would have a thick blue copper cable running out the wall that you had to plug into your computer in order to get onto the internet. Today, all that copper is gone. There is not a single blue cable in any American hotel room unless somebody has forgotten it. It's been completely dematerialized. We are not using atoms at all. It's just passing through the air. Instead of books, we are saving a lot of trees by relying on our tablets. Instead of mail, we have email. Instead of vinyl records, we have streaming. Instead of maps, I'm old enough to remember that if we were going to a different country or a different town, we had maps, and then we would tell, okay, Dad, take the right, because the map says so. Now, an irritating voice on your ways tells you where to go. And of course, finally, there is this. This is not just a phone. It's also a compass. It's also a TV. It's a camera. It's a notepad. It's a record player. It's all sorts of other things. So imagine a pile of different electronics that you would have to have and all the atoms that would go into building it. Instead, you've got that in your hand. Reuse. All the metals and minerals that Earth has ever had are still here. Okay, we shot a few tons of titanium and steel into space, but other than that, everything else is here on Earth, but it is trapped in certain constructions. So for example, there's a lot of steel in our buildings. But if for some reason we couldn't make any more steel, we could just tear down the buildings, take the steel, and refashion it into something else. People reuse materials all the time. When the Americans were building atomic weapon during the Manhattan Project in the 1940s, the only way that they could make electromagnets, we could make electromagnets, I'm an American now. Anyway, we could make electromagnets was by using silver, which then allowed for enrichment of uranium. And so the Manhattan Project borrowed 14,000 tons of silver from the American government to use in those electromagnets, which after the war was returned back to the government. Now we no longer use silver, we use copper and many other things. Transmutation. For centuries, smartest people in the world were wondering how to transmute base metals into expensive metals. People like Newton, for example, were searching for ways in which you take, for example, a pound of lead and turn it into a pound of gold. That was called alchemy. But transmutation has happened. It happened decades ago. When we were able to use neutron bombardment to turn lead into gold, it's incredibly expensive. To make an ounce of gold through neutron bombardment, it would require quadrillions of dollars. But imagine a situation in the future where you have unlimited amount of energy. That way you can turn any metal into any other metal. What about minerals? We already know how to make the most expensive mineral out there, which is of course diamond. Methane, heated to extreme temperatures, can be turned into carbon vapor, which then deposits layer upon layer of carbon, creating artificial diamonds, artificial diamonds, which, by the way, are chemically and physically indistinguishable from natural diamonds, which is why the price of natural diamonds is collapsing, and which is why any woman in the future will be able to have as big diamonds as they want to. That is my prediction. Finally, thousands of years in the future, well, perhaps decades in the future, my point is, we have enough materials to last us for thousands of years. But should we need more, there is always space mining. We already have all the components necessary in order to undertake space mining. We have humanoid robots, we have solar energy, and we have AI. There is absolutely nothing preventing us from shooting armies of humanoids into the asteroid belt, which is rich in water and many other elements in order to mine and bring it back to Earth. So, what we really need is more knowledge, and more knowledge, and knowledge, oh, let me start again. So what we really need is more knowledge. And knowledge, unlike atoms, is potentially unlimited. Or as Paul Roman, the Nobel Prize in Economy, says, we consistently fail to grasp how many ideas remain to be discovered. The difficulty is the same that we have with compounding. Possibilities do not add up, they multiply. To illustrate his point, Romer points to something as simple as composite materials. The periodic table contains about 100 different types of elements. And a recipe for a successful or useful two-element composite requires up to 9,900 combinations. So what you have to do, you have to multiply 100 by 99 in order to get a useful two-element compound, such as, for example, when we combine copper and tin and get the Bronze Age. Now, a recipe for a two-element compound requires up to 94 million combinations, 100 times 99 times 98 times 97. One type of stainless steel, for example, contains 4 components: iron, chromium, nickel, and manganese. And it is so durable that it is particularly useful in the metro systems. Many of you may have taken it whilst being in DC. Because metros need a specific balance of strength and lighter weight for improved fuel efficiency. Now, once you get to 10-element compounds, Roma explains, there are more possibilities than the number of seconds since the beginning of the Big Bang 14 billion years ago. In other words, there are more recipes to create more resources than the time that has elapsed since the beginning of the universe. And as you keep going, it becomes obvious that there are simply too few people and too little time since we have shown up for us to have tried but a minuscule fraction of all the possibilities. Future prosperity of our species, in other words, is not constrained by the physical limitations of the planet, but by the amount of new knowledge that we can generate. Thank you very much.
We'll take questions at the microphones on the side. Please identify yourself and where you're from.
I'll try.
Oh, go ahead, yeah, absolutely, yeah.
My
Let's not
name
waste
is
time, yeah.
Luke German. I go to Ashland University, and you noted a lot about the importance of, I believe that humans do have the capability to innovate, to resource. That's always been the case. But you also really emphasize the importance of wages and the ability to humans to keep their wages, because that's what drives innovation. What impact do you think AI might have on the ability for humans to keep jobs, or do you think that might push humans out of the workforce, thus eliminating their innovative capabilities?
Thank you. Important question to which nobody has an answer right now. Right now, the early evidence suggests that AI increases jobs rather than decreases it. From a study just came out last month looking at a specific sector of the American economy, I can't remember which, showed that actually that companies armed with AI are expanding because workers with AI becoming more productive, and consequently they're actually hiring more people rather than not. So far AI has done what every previous technology has done, which is to make us more productive, but also lead to an increase in employment. In 1900, 40% of Americans were still employed as farmers. Today it's 2%, but other jobs have been created, such as service sector and whatever. Similar concerns that are over AI have been expressed during the IT revolution in the 1990s, but actually what we forgot about is that every department with an AI needs people to oversee AI and make sure that the copiers work and fax machines don't break down and whatever else. So far, every one of these large technological revolutions has been to the benefit of humanity, and we've never run out of work. It is even a question of is that even a logical proposition? If human needs are in fact infinite, then by definition there has to be an infinite amount of work that needs to be done.
Yeah, so my question was basically that you mentioned in your presentation that when economies liberalize, they tend to become wealthier, but it also seems to be the case around the world that while it's true that when countries liberalize their economies, they become wealthier, it also seems to be the trend that wealthier countries tend to be the ones where the birth rates are collapsing most severely. Specifically, there seems to be a correlation between the collapse in birth rates amongst the more educated parts of the population. So how do you sort of square this conflict between increasing wealth and education and also collapsing birth rates?
Yeah, I'm not sure that it's squareable. I mean, sometimes there are unintended consequences to things that happen in the world. Now, the thing is that those trends seem to be changing as we speak. The newest data from Europe, for example, suggests that women have more children in the richest European countries rather than in the poor countries. So you're right that for the longest time the assumption was that the richer you get, the fewer babies you have. But now some of the lowest birth rates are experienced actually in middle income countries and even in lower income countries. So the link between wealth and TFR, total fertility rate, seems to have been broken down. Now that doesn't help us altogether because TFR in poor countries as well as rich countries is well below 2.1, right? Unless you are talking about some countries in Africa where it's well above 2, but in most countries it's well below 2. So that doesn't help us, but the connection here is much more complicated than we thought because it has flipped, and rich people are now having more children even though it's less than 2.1 than poor people, okay? Now, there are a lot of things going on here, opportunity cost for women, but also I think that it is probably connected in some ways to NIMBYism, the fact that our housing, because of over-regulations, are costing so much that people have to wait, for example, longer in order to save up enough money to move out of their parents' houses. Another thing which may be a problem is that our higher education is over-subsidized, and consequently far too many people spend too much time at university rather than they would, for example, starting a life, maybe marrying and having children and so forth. So there's a lot of distortions going on, and anybody who tells you that they know exactly what is going on are probably BSing you because it is very much a fluid situation.
My name is Max Pollins. I first wanted to say that as a chemist, I really appreciate your perspective on a field I have personal experience with.
I hope I didn't make any obvious mistakes. I'm not a chemist.
My question was regarding currently liberalized governments, such as the United States. What policies should they pursue to address current shortages, such as the lack of affordable housing in the United States?
look, obviously, NIMBYism is a problem. A lot of things are going on. The federal government sits on a lot of land which could give away, and maybe people would start building houses there. Localities have put into force, into action, a lot of restrictions on building. Before I became a homeowner, obviously, I was hoping, every homeowner, I mean, before we buy our houses, we want to have as much housing as possible. The moment that you actually own a place, you want as little housing as possible, because then your price is, the price of your house is going up, and consequently, you can hope for a better, better retirement, right? So there are some of these human impulses at hand. Free trade matters, right? So much of our timber, for example, for housing comes from Canada, and we are putting tariffs on these people. I mean, it's insane. So I would say maximum free trade so that the inputs into housing can be cheap. Then, of course, deregulation of housing, taking away the power of homeowners to basically prevent new housing from happening. And, you know, one thing which I find so encouraging is so many young people now get it, because you've been messed up by your elders who simply don't think about your well-being. You know, you're going to be putting money into Social Security that you're not going to receive. You're going to be saving up for housing, which is more expensive than it ought to be. And so, you know, you ought to be thinking about these things. Did I answer your question?
Hi, my name's Luke. I'll be attending UChicago this fall. My question is, you mentioned space mining. Why aren't we currently racing to capitalize off that opportunity right now if we have all the resources to do so?
Well, I mean, the stuff is coming together, but it's coming together right now, right? Elon Musk's Starship, for example, which would be the obvious vehicle for armies of humanoids, that's not even working properly yet. Right? Then the humanoids, both in China and the United States, are getting more sophisticated, but not quite. We are not quite there yet. Then you have to power them with AI. All of these technologies. What I'm not saying that any of these technologies individually is mature. What I'm saying is that they are obviously coming together, and once they become mature, then we can do it. Right now, and for thousands of years, we don't actually have any need for space mining. But should we need to do it, we could within the next probably, you know, couple of decades.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Augustin from University College London, and I'd like to ask you about bread. In one of your first slides, we learned that the real price of bread decreased by 5%, but the time price by 18%. There's 13% between the two. But both measures seek to find the true value of our goods and services over time. Why is there such a huge difference? And do you think that then the CPI is an imprecise measure?
Because time prices, because wages are increasing at a faster pace than prices, essentially, right? The reason why somebody in Burundi earns $2 a day, but a typical American blue-collar worker earns $30 an hour, is because the typical American worker, being better educated and having access to better technology, is more productive. So productivity matters. And productivity increases usually annually, right? So a typical American is now obviously much better off than a typical American in 1776. And that's because the typical American is much more productive, right? And productivity increases at a faster pace than inflation. That is why we are richer. That is why we are still not covered in mud in the fields digging potatoes. We are much richer because we are much more productive, and productivity increases above the rate of inflation. And that is why time prices that is why time prices are lower than inflation-adjusted prices or real prices. Did that make any sense?
Yes, yeah, that makes sense.
Okay. If wages were only increasing at an inflation rate, then standard of living would be the same forever. It would never change. You need to be constantly more productive.
So basically, I should use the two measures as two distinctly different things, not seeking to find the same.
They are distinct things, correct. They are distinct things. Yes.
Let me just suggest nobody else get in line, because we're going to run out of time. We'll hopefully get us through as many as we can.
My name is Rivka Kadim, and I actually kind of want to debate some of the points you brought up. And so, isn't it kind of more accurate to say that even as total resources grow, that doesn't necessarily equate to access to these resources? And I feel like that's best proven by the top 1%ers and the widening gap.
The reason why in our book, which one day you may read, we only look at blue-collar workers' wages and unskilled worker wages is precisely to get around that criticism. We knew that if we try to measure abundance of American food, for example, with average wages, we would be attacked because inequality distorts the picture. But because we evaluate affordability of food and fuel, et cetera, by looking at blue-collar workers, people who make cars, or unskilled laborers, people who clean the floors, we are able to say that a typical American worker is much better off than he or she was 100 years ago. The prices that I showed you for eggs, the 2,500% increase in affordability or abundance of eggs, that wasn't somebody living on Wall Street. That was a blue-collar worker living in Michigan. Okay? So it is incorrect to say that the gains have only been gotten by the rich. The book is filled with data looking at the less fortunate Americans. Did that answer your question?
Not necessarily,
okay.
But I want to give everyone a chance to ask their own. Thank you.
No worries.
Hello, my name is Austin. Thank you for your talk. I really enjoyed it. So you've laudably tried to make us more optimistic about the future, but what if the implication of the facts you presented is that humanity is doomed? Because if liberalism's made us so much richer over the past 200 years, and everyone's against liberalism nowadays, isn't humanity damned to regress to the mean?
Okay, try to expand on it a little.
Well, like, political and economic freedom have made us extremely rich, unimaginably rich. But people don't realize this. So they've gone away from liberalism, they're embracing socialism, they're embracing nationalism. So maybe the 200 years of progress we've experienced is just an outlier, and then we're going to regress to the mean of most of human history, which is, poverty, barbarism, and starvation.
Get it, right. And eating each other. Yeah, I run a human progress, but there's nothing guaranteed about human progress, right? If you look at human progress literature from late 1800s, because of influence of Hegel and history with capital H, people believed there were forces in the world, sort of autonomous forces which were driving humanity toward a certain goal, sort of Hegelian dialectic. I don't believe that. I think that the future is in our hands, and we can screw it up or we can make it better. So there's nothing guaranteed about the future. And you're absolutely right that this is not the first what economic historians call the word is efflorescence. There had been other efflorescences in human species before. Athens, Rome, Abbasid Caliphate, Gupta India, Florence, where in small parts of the world, suddenly people figured out how to do something better and became twice as rich or even 3 times as rich before descending into barbarism. After all, after the collapse of Rome, we do have the Dark Ages, right? Where Europeans wander amongst like hobbits through Middle Earth, surrounded by aqueducts and temples and theaters that they have no idea how to build. So that's always possible, and the big question is whether this current period of human efflorescence will come to an end, and that will depend on all of us.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Caleb Dewberry. I'm from Arizona Christian University. My question is, with your superabundance, if that is by means of the increase of innovation and population, then how does this account for poverty and homelessness in that regard of that correlation?
I don't think that you need to account for poverty. Poverty is the natural station of mankind. We've been poor ever since we emerged out of Africa 300,000 years ago. Poverty is the natural state. We don't have to account for it. We have to account for why some countries are rich and why some countries are poor. And my argument is that countries which liberalize, which is to say countries which allow their people to have a go, to accomplish something with their lives, to improve their lives and those of their families, work better. The reason why West Germany was richer than East Germany is because West Germans were more free. The reason why South Korea is 30 times richer than North Korea is because South Korea is freer. The reason why Chile is the richest country in Latin America, along with Uruguay, and Argentina and Venezuela are not, is because they are more free. So that's what needs explanation. Why are some countries rich, not why we are poor? Did that answer your question?
Yeah. Hi, my name is Ethan. I'm a political econ major at Tulane. My question for you is, obviously, at the beginning of humanity, everyone worked for food. There was no people to think. And hypothetically, if everyone was a thinker and spent all their time thinking, we'd all starve to death because no one's actually growing the crops. So what's the optimal percentage of people that work on ideas and the people that actually do the labor?
I don't know if the answer is how many people think necessarily, because thinking is just a part of the process. You have to have the creative genius. You have to have that spark. Nobody knows where innovation comes from. You could prove to be the most important innovator in the world, but we wouldn't know it about you right now. When Elon Musk was growing up in Pretoria in the 1980s, nobody knew that he would become the greatest engineer of the 21st century, and perhaps longer. Where the creative genius comes from, it's not, IQ matters. IQ is very important, but there is something else to it, right? That's something we don't know. Governments try to encourage innovation. The European Union, the United States, we spend a lot of money on innovation, but it's very difficult to identify the right people. They sort of have to emerge. And so you want to have as free society as possible so that somebody who is somebody with Asperger's, right, can, instead of being shunned by society, can create SpaceX. You have to be tolerant enough. You have to be open enough to take a weirdo and say, you know what? Have a ball. Go for it. Have a go.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your talk. My name is Nico Berlinson from Claremont McKenna College. I had a question in regards to relation to climate change and your topics about human innovation. I'm wondering, with recent governments, specifically the Trump administration, defunding bills or organizations that help regulate the environment, I'm wondering how humanity can continue to survive and their level of abundance when we continue to destroy the planet. And I'm wondering how to disincentivize oil companies from continuing to produce, and is it the role of government, or if not, what else? How do we stop production at a certain point?
Striking the balance is obviously one of the most important features of modernity, striking the balance between economic growth and environmental damage. There is no question that environment got damaged during the Industrial Revolution in the West. But what tends to happen is what is called environmental Kuznets curve, is that as you grow richer, environmental damage increases, but at certain point, a few thousand, I don't know what it is, $5,000 or $10,000 per capita, you become so rich that you suddenly start to value things other than making money. Making money is important because you want to have as much money as possible because you want to create a better future for your children and have a better life. But you also start valuing other things. And so consequently, as people grow richer, they become much more cognizant of the environment, which is why today, if you compare the Yale Environmental Index and GDP per capita, there is a relationship whereby the richest countries are also the cleanest and the poorest countries are the. When the economy of Venezuela collapsed, people ate the animals in zoo. That's not environmentally friendly, but that's what they had to do because they were poor, right? So that's at a micro level. On the macro level, I would say, I don't think that anybody has done more harm to the environment than environmentalists. By destroying the nuclear revolution of the 1970s, by basically grinding atomic power into the dust, they've ensured that in 2025, most of our energy is still coming from fossil fuels, which it didn't have to. Had the 1970s continued in the way it did, the world would have been peppered today by fission power stations and maybe even fusion power stations. And we would be using fossil fuels for jet fuel and possibly shipping. Everything else would be electrified and run by uranium. That revolution got smothered because of irrational fear of radiation and whatever else. But the sooner we embrace nuclear fission and nuclear fusion, the sooner we can get away from fossil fuels. And that's the future that we all want. But we could have been there. This could have been the future.
This will be the last question.
So you mentioned that ideas don't add up, they multiply and compound. So you also brought up the example that 10 elements have more possible combinations than seconds in the universe. So I guess I'm wondering, at some point, can new innovations take so much time that we won't see compounding returns?
Well, that is why we want AI to help us to get through as many innovations as possible. So let's imagine an AI in 5 years' time which has enough genetic information about human beings to be able to run human trials for new drugs. Let's say, for example, that you decide that somebody has an MS or whatever, you want to help them. You tell AI to develop the necessary molecule and then to run human trials virtually to find out whether it is safe and not. That is how. That is why we are moving, or we want to move toward quantum computing, for example. We want to be able to run millions, even trillions of calculations at the same time. Right now, computing is simply too slow to allow us to do that. Once we do quantum, and we have AI, we can do that. So.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.